responsible for this! I want this trench gone now, or I'm calling the county!
At 6 in the morning, in the kind of February cold that goes straight through denim and flannel, I was standing at the edge of my south field holding a metal coffee mug and staring at something that did not belong there. A white, luxury SUV, clean enough to reflect the pale winter light, expensive enough to look absurd against frozen dirt and yellow stubble, and parked right in the middle of my wheat ground like it had every right in the world to be there. My dog, a blue heeler named Grit, circled it low and slow, not barking, just watching. Behind me, my excavator sat idling, its diesel thumping through the quiet. The bucket hung in the air, black and heavy, like a period at the end of a sentence. Then the driver's door opened. Out stepped Beverly. No wave, no apology, no sorry wrong turn. She stepped down onto my field in a pressed coat and leather gloves, looked me over from my muddy boots to my work jacket, and said in the calmest voice imaginable, "We're just doing some survey work, Mr. Warden. This is for the benefit of the neighborhood." For the benefit of the neighborhood. That was the line. That was the phrase that had cost me 2 years of aggravation, thousands in attorney fees, a stack of county filings, and more patience than any man ought to have to spend defending land his family had worked for 3 generations. I didn't answer her right away. I took one slow drink of coffee and looked from her to the SUV and then to the open stretch of field behind it. Because that moment only makes sense if you understand 2 things first: who I am, and how this woman decided she had the authority to make my farm her personal project. My name is Colt Warden. I'm 58 years old, and every season of my adult life has been spent on the same 140 acres in Harlan County, Tennessee. My grandfather bought this place in 1951 with railroad wages, stubbornness, and borrowed money from kin who trusted him enough to bet on dirt. He raised row crops here. My father expanded the operation, added cattle, improved the rotation, patched fences, bought used equipment, and taught me that a farm survives on discipline more than luck. When my father died, he left me a worn-out tractor, a handshake arrangement with 2 nearby farmers, and land that still had enough life in it to reward anybody willing to work harder than comfort would allow. It isn't romantic land. It smells like diesel, manure, old hay, creek mud, and grease. In spring, it turns your boots into weights. In July, it bakes the hood of a pickup too hot to touch. In winter, it rings under your heels like iron. But it's ours, and every line of fence and ditch and pasture on it means something to me. The trouble started when the old parcel west of my boundary got sold. For decades, that land belonged to the Tillman family. When farming stopped making sense for them, they sold to a developer called Ridgerest Properties. A couple of years later, a subdivision went in. Nice brick houses, trimmed lawns, decorative shutters, community mailbox, a walking trail, the whole package. They named it Sunrise Estates, which I suppose sounds better than former cattle ground with HOA fees. At first, I had no issue with any of it. People can do what they want with land they buy. That's how ownership works. The important part was this: my property was never part of their development, never part of their covenants, never part of their rules. My farm predates their neighborhood by around 60 years, legally, clean and simple. Then Beverly moved in. She was a retired HR executive from Nashville, which explained a lot about the way she spoke. Every sentence sounded pre-approved by committee. Everything came in the tone of a woman who had spent decades documenting infractions and calling it professionalism. She ran for HOA president when no one else wanted the job, won easily, and within a few months she had apparently decided that the greatest unresolved issue in Sunrise Estates was me. The first letter complained that my grain silo was unattractive from the walking trail. The silo had been standing since the 1970s. The walking trail was brand new. The second letter said the lights from my tractor before sunrise were disturbing residents. Harvest doesn't wait for anyone's sleep schedule. The third was worse. She filed a complaint with the county, claiming my cattle operation created a nuisance under a revised local ordinance she had dug up and tried to weaponize. That filing got thrown out, but not before it cost me time, money, and 2 days during a stretch of the year when I could least afford to be sitting in an office instead of on my land. I spoke to her once at a county meeting, plain and polite. I told her my operations were lawful, My rights were clear, and I'd appreciate it if she confined her attention to the neighborhood she'd actually been elected to manage. She smiled like I'd just made a beginner's mistake. Communities evolve, she said. Sometimes the surrounding area has to evolve with them. That was the moment I understood this wasn't about bins, lights, or aesthetics. She didn't want coexistence, she wanted correction. She looked at a working farm and saw an outdated inconvenience. And once somebody decides your existence is the problem, they rarely stop at one complaint. By summer, I was working 16-hour days in heat thick enough to chew, and she escalated again. A formal application landed in my mailbox proposing a mandatory vegetative buffer along my western line. In plain English, she wanted the county to require me to plant a screen of approved trees on my land at my expense, so residents of Sunrise Estates wouldn't have to look at my farm. I read that letter twice at my kitchen table while the unit rattled and failed to keep up. Grit lay on the tile, one ear lifted, watching me go quiet. Then I called my attorney. Prescott Hale had handled Warden family land matters since my father's day. He was old, steady, and allergic to nonsense. He listened, then said, "Agricultural land is exempt, Section 14209, been that way for years. She either didn't know or hoped you didn't." He filed the objection. The county rejected her request. Beverly sat through the meeting in a blazer and a hard expression while the commission denied her effort in public. I thought that might slow her down. Instead, it taught her that she needed a different angle, and the next one was uglier because she stopped going after my property and started going after my name. And that's where things began to turn. Because once somebody moves from filing complaints to smearing your reputation, you stop dealing with irritation and start dealing with intent. And intent is where a real fight begins. What Beverly did next didn't target my land records or my fence line. It targeted my buyers, my reputation, and the future of the farm itself. The next phase of Beverly's campaign didn't arrive in an envelope. It came through other people. A neighbor called first, Dorrance Kimball, who ran peaches on the east side of my property and had no patience for foolishness, phoned me one evening and said, "You need to hear this before it gets any bigger. Your HOA friend has been going door to door with a petition." I sat down on my porch steps while he talked. According to him, Beverly was telling Sunrise Estates residents that runoff from my farm might be affecting the creek, that there were environmental concerns, that further agricultural review was needed. She wasn't just filing things with offices anymore. She was working the neighborhood, building a narrative, planting doubt. That sort of thing matters more than people realize. A bad county complaint is expensive. A bad rumor is poisonous. We sell cattle. We sell grain. We deal with suppliers and buyers and people who talk to each other. Farming is built as much on trust as it is on yield. Once somebody starts whispering that your operation is unsafe, dirty, or non-compliant, the damage spreads faster than facts can catch it. And what bothered me most was this. My family had farmed that watershed for decades without a single violation. I'd invested in erosion control. I kept records. I maintained the creek banks. If there had been a real issue, I would have fixed it. But there wasn't one. Beverly wasn't responding to a problem. She was shopping for leverage. I had two choices at that point: get loud or get organized. I chose organized. The next morning, I called the Tennessee Department of Agriculture and asked for a voluntary compliance inspection. A lot of people don't know you can do that. If you run a clean operation and somebody is stirring up accusations, inviting inspectors in can be one of the smartest moves you'll ever make. Let the state walk the ground. Let them look at your practices. Let them date stamp the truth. They came out, reviewed the land, checked the relevant areas, and found nothing improper. Clean, documented, signed. I hung that compliance letter in my equipment barn, not because I needed decoration, but because every fight like this eventually comes down to records, not feelings, not gossip, paper. That same week, I started a written log. Every letter, every phone call, every message, every incident, date, time, description, response. I'd done the same thing years earlier in a boundary dispute, and that habit paid for itself 10 times over. Most people in a conflict rely on memory. Memory gets emotional. Logs don't. Fall came in hard and fast. Wheat to plant, equipment to service, fence posts to reset before the ground stiffened. I had enough real work to handle without babysitting a suburban crusade. Then Beverly found a new target, my access road. Along the western side of my farm, there's an unpaved farm lane I use to reach the lower fields, gravel, clay, ruts, and history. My family had used that route long before there was a subdivision next door. On dry days, trucks and tractors kick up dust. That's not a scandal, that's a road. Apparently, Beverly had gathered statements from residents claiming the dust aggravated allergies and harmed vehicle paint. She filed a nuisance complaint. The deputy who showed up looked embarrassed to be there. He logged it because procedure required it, then left. Prescott later explained what I already suspected. When people move beside an existing agricultural operation and then complain about conditions inherent to that operation, the law often looks at who was there first. That principle matters a lot. But even when you win, winning costs. Every complaint took time. Every response took money. Every dismissed claim still extracted something from me. And that, I started to realize, might be the point. Maybe Beverly didn't need to beat me in court. Maybe she only needed to make farming this place expensive enough, frustrating enough, uncertain enough that selling would begin to look like relief. That thought stopped feeling paranoid when Riva spoke up. Riva handled my books and records, sharp-eyed, precise, and not given to exaggeration. One Tuesday morning she pulled me aside and said her cousin, who lived in Sunrise Estates, had seen a discussion at an HOA meeting about long-term rezoning goals. Not trail maintenance, not mailbox paint, rezoning. That changed everything. A person filing petty complaints is one kind of problem. A person participating in a larger effort to change the status of the land around them is another. If that area ever shifted towards rural residential pressure, even if it didn't directly erase my rights overnight, it could create the kind of long-term squeeze developers love. Restrictions, hearings, friction, one little cut at a time until the owner bleeds patience and sells. So I began asking quiet questions, not accusations, questions. And the more I asked, the less random Beverly started to look. I learned Ridge Rest Properties had interest in future expansion. I learned my acreage sat exactly where Phase 2 would logically want to go if Sunrise Estates ever grew. I learned that Beverly, whether knowingly or not, was acting in a way that benefited that vision almost perfectly. Then, in early November, she overstepped in a way that nobody could spin. I drove down to my western gate one morning and found it blocked with orange cones and a hand-painted sign that said the road was closed for an environmental review. On my property. There was a folding table, too, with a young guy in a safety vest who looked like he'd been paid to stand somewhere without being told the details. I rolled down my window and asked him what exactly he thought he was doing. He told me the road was temporarily closed per HOA procedures. I told him the road was on private land, the HOA had no authority there whatsoever, and if he didn't clear out immediately, the sheriff would be invited to explain the matter in person. He packed up and left within minutes. I called the non-emergency line anyway and filed a report, added it to the log, added the photos, added the date. And from that point on, I understood something clearly. This was no longer just a paperwork battle. Beverly had crossed into physical interference. January arrived colder than it had any right to be. Most mornings the ground rang underfoot and the air burned your lungs. I was running the excavator, working on a drainage project I'd planned for 2 seasons, when Taft came hurrying over with his phone in his hand. He looked like he was carrying bad news, and he was. Beverly made a public post in the Sunrise Estates Facebook group. An aerial image of my farm marked up with arrows and circles like an accusation board, claiming there were possible environmental violations on my property and encouraging residents to document activity. That post changed the fight, because once false claims go public, you stop dealing with inconvenience and start collecting evidence for something much more serious. I took photos of the screen. I called Riva to begin archiving everything. Then I called Prescott. He didn't even wait for me to finish before saying, "Save it all, timestamps, comments, shares, every last piece." Because what Beverly had just handed us might be the first thing she had done that could cost her far more than it ever cost me. The Facebook post was bad, but what my attorney discovered right after it turned the entire case upside down. When Beverly published that Facebook post, I knew it was reckless. What I didn't know yet was that it might also be expensive. Prescott did. He told me to preserve every version of it, screenshots with timestamps, comments, replies, shares, reposts. He wanted a full chain of evidence because public false statements about a business, or in my case, a commercial farm, can cross a line from obnoxious to actionable in a hurry. So that's what we did. Riva built a folder structure so organized it could have taught a government office how to file documents properly. Taft started capturing screenshots as they appeared. I noted the dates and saved everything to both digital and physical records. The more Beverly talked, the stronger our file became. At the same time, I made another call. There was a local reporter named Glenwood Fitch who had done strong work on rural land pressure in our region the previous year. I didn't pitch him a scandal. I didn't ask for a favor. I invited him out to walk the property, review compliance records, and see the situation for himself. That distinction mattered to me. If a man is going to write about your life, you want him working from facts, not theatrics. Glenwood came out in late January. We walked the fence lines, the creek bank, the access road. He read the state compliance letter, reviewed dismissed complaints, and listened more than he spoke. It was cold enough that your words came out in fog, and all morning the subdivision roofs sat just beyond the trees like a reminder of how close this whole thing had gotten. At one point he said something carefully, almost casually. Ridgerest Properties, he told me, had been in touch with county officials about possible expansion, nothing formal enough yet to make headlines, but enough chatter to confirm they were thinking ahead. And yes, my parcel had come up. There it was. The suspicion I'd had for months, now echoed by someone outside the dispute. Beverly's campaign wasn't random. Whether she understood the full picture or not, the practical outcome of her actions was obvious. Pressure the farmer, erode the operation's reputation, multiply the hassle, and maybe eventually the land changes hands. But the real turning point came not from Glenwood, it came from Prescott. A few days after that visit, he called me on a Friday afternoon and said he'd found something in the original development records for Sunrise Estates. His voice had a different weight to it, like a man carrying dynamite in both hands and choosing his footing carefully. He had been reviewing title and filing documents tied to Ridgerest's original agreement with the county. Buried in that paperwork was a covenant connected to the development approval, one of those clauses most people never read after signing because they assume it'll never matter again. This one mattered. Ridgerest, along with its assigns, related entities, and any HOA operating within the development, had agreed to a non-harassment provision regarding adjacent agricultural land for a fixed term. In plain language, the development and its governing bodies were not supposed to initiate legal, regulatory, or administrative harassment against neighboring farmland within the buffer area during that period. The term had not expired. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with one hand on the phone and Grit's head resting against my knee while Prescott explained it a second time just to make sure I fully understood. Every county complaint, every nuisance filing, every effort to push new requirements on my property, potentially all of it sat in direct conflict with a covenant Ridgerest had already signed. And because Beverly was acting as HOA president, that didn't just create a nuisance history, it opened a much larger door. Suddenly, we weren't only talking about false accusations and wasted time, we were talking about breach, leverage, and exposure for a developer with money, lawyers, and future plans they probably didn't want complicated by public records. I asked Prescott what we should do. He gave me an answer that required restraint. "Nothing yet," he said. "Don't warn her, don't show your hand, let her keep building the file." That's the sort of advice that sounds simple until you try living it. Most people want to strike the second they learn they've been wronged, but early anger rarely produces the best outcome. Prescott wanted accumulation. Every new complaint after our discovery wasn't just harassment anymore, it was additional evidence. So I waited, and Beverly, true to form, gave us more. Through a relative of Riva's in Sunrise Estates, we learned Beverly had been taking boundary measurements from inside the neighborhood and asking questions about the western edge of my property. Taft had also noticed unexplained tire tracks near one of my gates. She was clearly preparing for something that involved coming closer, maybe coming onto the land, maybe trying to document something she believed would help her next filing. Meanwhile, I was already working on a drainage ditch project. That matters, and I want to be precise about it. The ditch was not improvised, it was not a stunt, it was part of farm work I had planned well in advance and connected to a larger water management plan I'd had on record for years. January and February are ugly months on a farm, but they're good months for heavy work that would be harder to tackle during active growing or harvest periods. So the excavator was out, the line had been thought through, and the work was real. As the days passed, the pieces started settling into place in a way I couldn't ignore. Beverly wanted access to my boundary. My gate had shown interest. My drainage work was progressing toward the very area anyone snooping that line would naturally use. And if she trespassed while I was conducting lawful scheduled work on my own land, the consequences of that would be her problem, not mine. I called Prescott and made sure he knew exactly what work I was doing and where. He asked the right questions. Was it documented? Yes. Was it previously planned? Yes. Would I be deviating from my normal operational rights? No. Then he said I could proceed with my farm work as any landowner would, provided it remained exactly that, farm work. That was good enough for me. I also called Glenwood and mentioned that I'd be doing the next phase of drainage work in the south field and that given the ongoing dispute, he might find it useful to observe routine agricultural operations. I didn't tell him to expect a show, I just gave him a date range. Then I waited. Those February nights were strangely calm. The planning was done, the legal angles were in place, my records were clean, the evidence folders were stacked, the excavator was fueled. All that remained was for Beverly to decide whether she would finally stay on her side of the fence. She did not. On a Sunday morning, just after 6, Taft spotted a white Lexus inside my gate, engine off, parked on my field, and that was the morning the whole thing moved from theory to proof. Because once an unauthorized vehicle is sitting on private land before sunrise with the owner nowhere to be seen, there is no longer much room for interpretation, only documentation and consequences. When I got to the field and saw Beverly's USV parked on my property, I knew two things instantly. She had made a mistake, and I was not going to waste it. By the time Taft called me that morning, I was already awake. Farm habits don't care whether it's Sunday. He said there was a vehicle inside the west gate. I told him not to touch anything, not to approach anyone, and to stay where he could observe. Then I headed down there myself. The truck heater hadn't even fully warmed up by the time I rolled into the south field. The SUV looked almost unreal sitting there. Bright white paint against frozen ground, clean tires, luxury trim. The kind of vehicle you see outside high-end grocery stores or office parks, not in a working field before daylight. Grit jumped down from the passenger seat and began circling it like a deputy with 4 legs. I took photographs first. That part was automatic by then. Wide shots showing the gate, close shots showing the tire tracks, property markers in frame, fence line in frame, frost still visible on the ground, timestamp active. I wanted every possible angle documented before anything else happened. Then I called the sheriff's non-emergency line and filed a trespassing report. Report number noted, time logged. Only after that did I shift my attention back to the actual work I had planned to do that day. This is the point where people like to imagine something dramatic or lawless. It wasn't either of those. I didn't touch Beverly's vehicle. I didn't threaten it. I didn't lay a hand on it, scratch it, block it with machinery, or damage so much as a mirror. What I did was continue the drainage work I was already scheduled to do on my own property, using the excavator I was already running along the route already planned for the ditch phase. That route curved through the field in a way that eventually left her vehicle surrounded by 3 sides by fresh trench and on the 4th by newly turned ground too soft for an easy exit. By mid-morning, the SUV wasn't wrecked, it wasn't trapped underground, it wasn't touched, but it absolutely was not driving itself out of there. And every inch of that result had been caused by lawful farm work. Odell watched from near the equipment shed with his arms folded and the look of a man witnessing craftsmanship. At one point he yelled across, "Is that legal?" I yelled back, perfectly, because it was. The difference between destruction and consequence matters. Beverly created the first condition by parking on land she didn't own. I created the second by continuing to use my land the way I had every right to use it. At 10:47 a.m., I sent her a text, polite, brief, factual. I informed her that her vehicle appeared to be on my private property without permission, that a trespassing report had been filed, and that due to active drainage work in the area, retrieval would require a tow service. I even included the name of a local towing company I'd recommend. That last part still makes Taft laugh. She arrived not long after that with 2 HOA board members and her husband's truck. Apparently, someone had imagined a tow strap and optimism would solve the problem. They stepped out, walked to the edge of the trench, and stood there staring at the SUV in silence long enough for the point to settle in. Beverly turned and looked at me across the ditch. "You did this on purpose." The accusation hung in the cold air. I answered exactly the way I had planned to answer if that line came. "I'm conducting scheduled drainage work on my property. The plan is documented. A trespassing report was filed this morning. Your vehicle was already here." She looked furious, but fury is not a legal argument. One of the board members, Cortland, was already on his phone, no doubt calling somebody who charged by the hour. The other one, Peg, looked like she had begun reconsidering every decision that had led her into Beverly's orbit. Eventually, the tow truck came. Lester himself handled it. He took one look at the situation and quoted accordingly. It required time, equipment, positioning, and patience. Watching an expensive SUV get slowly winched out of a predicament caused entirely by its owner's arrogance has a way of calming a man's blood pressure. Glenwood had arrived by then too. He stayed back, said very little, and documented everything from a respectful distance, which was perfect. I didn't need commentary, I needed witnesses. That evening, Beverly posted in the Sunrise Estates group again, describing the incident as deliberate intimidation and making legal noises about it. But things had shifted. The support she'd counted on began to crack. By then, Prescott had already moved to the next stage. He requested a pre-conference with Beverly's attorney, not because we had to, but because he wanted the other side in a room before a formal public blow-up made retreat more expensive. Beverly hired a polished HOA specialist from Knoxville. Nice portfolio, nice shoes. The sort of man used to rural disputes where the farmer is underdocumented and emotionally reactive. He was about to have a disappointing day. At the meeting, Prescott started with the basics: 2 years of complaints, dismissals, logged interactions, legal costs, social media evidence. The attorney absorbed it without much visible concern. Then Prescott placed the covenant on the table, certified copy, tabbed, highlighted, and he let the man read. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room when one side realizes the case is not what they thought it was. That silence lasted a while. The attorney asked for a short recess. It turned into a long one. When he came back, the confidence had changed shape. He was no longer managing a nuisance dispute. He was containing exposure. Prescott laid out our terms: immediate cessation of all HOA activity directed at my property, a public retraction for the defamatory statements, compensation for documented losses and legal costs, and a recorded reaffirmation of the non-harassment covenant, so the county record would make the future impossible to misunderstand. They asked for time. Prescott shortened the time, because there was one more fact tightening the clock, and Beverly had created that too. She had also filed a rezoning-related petition the same day her SUV ended up on my property. That meant the matter wasn't just private anymore, it was headed toward the public record. And once evidence like ours gets attached to a public proceeding, it stops being a negotiable inconvenience and becomes community history. That frightened the developer side far more than my frustration ever had. Which is why, after 2 years of pushing, pressuring, filing, accusing, and trespassing, Beverly was suddenly ready to talk settlement. But Prescott wasn't interested in a quiet exit, not yet, because the real resolution still had to happen in the one place Beverly had tried hardest to control: in front of the county, in public, on the record. Beverly thought the worst part was getting her Lexus towed out of my field. She was wrong. The public meeting that followed was the moment everything finally broke. The county board meeting was scheduled for February 14. Normally, those meetings are sleepy things: budget adjustments, road maintenance, procedural votes, and maybe a handful of citizens in folding chairs. But by the time that Thursday evening arrived, the dispute over my farm had grown teeth. A preview story had run in the local paper. Word had spread through the county. Farmers talk. Business owners talk. Church parking lots are as efficient as any media network ever built. By the time I walked into the community center, the room was full far beyond what anyone had expected. People lined the walls. Farmers I knew from the east side of the county were there. Shop owners from town were there. Folks I hadn't spoken to in years nodded when I came in. Durrance was already seated near the front. Riva had the binder in her lap. Odell stayed toward the back with a look that suggested he wouldn't miss this for anything. Prescott wore his one good suit. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had spent decades learning that preparation beats volume every time. Beverly was there too, front row, back straight, hands folded. That carefully neutral expression people wear when they've been told by counsel not to react on camera. What she knew, but had clearly not fully absorbed until that exact room, in that exact moment, was that her withdrawal of her petition would not be handled quietly through paperwork in a clerk's office. Prescott had insisted that if she filed publicly, she withdrew publicly. Same forum, same record, same community, no back door. The meeting opened and moved through routine items with unusual speed. Everyone could feel the real business waiting further down the agenda. When the rezoning-related item tied to Beverly's filing came up, the room changed. You could feel attention become physical. The board chair stated that a withdrawal request had been received and invited the petitioner to address the matter. Beverly stood. She had prepared remarks. That much was obvious immediately. Her wording was careful, polished, designed to sound intentional rather than defeated. She said that after reflection and consultation, she believed the best interests of the community would be focused on internal HOA matters rather than pursuing external regulatory action. It was professionally phrased. It still landed like surrender. Then the board chair did something I appreciated more than I expected. He stated for the record that the Warden parcel remained agricultural land, consistent with its designation dating back to 1951. He didn't have to add that last part, but he did. That sentence mattered, not because I needed emotional validation from the county, but because exact language in public settings has a long life. People quote it, reporters cite it, future officials remember it. It settled the matter in a way broader than legal paperwork ever could. The room exhaled. Not applause, not celebration, just that collective release that happens when something ugly has finally been named and ended. After the meeting, Glenwood spoke with me outside. It was cold, damp, and the parking lot lights gave everything that washed-out winter glow. Durrance and Prescott stood nearby. We looked, I suppose, like three men who had been carrying the same piece of timber for a long distance and had finally set it down. Glenwood asked what I wanted to say. I told him the truth, that the land belonged to my grandfather, then my father, and now me, that it had been producing since 1951 and would keep producing if I had anything to say about it, that I wasn't out looking for conflict, but I wasn't going anywhere either, and that if someone chose to spend 2 years filing bad faith complaints against a family farm and then trespassed onto it, they should not be surprised to discover that I knew my rights, kept records, and had competent counsel. He asked if he could quote that. I said yes. That article ran the next morning. After that, the legal cleanup moved fast. Specific financial terms stayed partly confidential, which is often how these things go once insurance carriers and developer counsel get involved. But I can tell you this much: my documented legal fees were covered, losses associated with the harassment were addressed, the defamatory social posts came down, and a formal retraction was issued. More importantly, Ridgerest Properties recorded written reaffirmation of the non-harassment covenant in county records for the remainder of its term. That meant what had been buried once in an old development file now sat front and center where anyone dealing with adjacent farmland could find it. Beverly resigned from the HOA presidency within days of the meeting. That part did not surprise me. What did surprise me was what happened next inside Sunrise Estates. A new HOA president was selected, Wallace, a part-time resident with farm roots of his own, and he called me directly. He said most people in the neighborhood had never wanted war with the farm and had no idea how far things had gone. He asked if we could start over. I told him my issue had never been the whole neighborhood. It had been a specific campaign by a specific person serving interests bigger than mailbox rules and landscaping preferences. He understood. That mattered too. Because communities can survive conflict if the truth is clear enough. The Pewitts put their home on the market not long afterward. I never asked where they went. Curiosity has its limits. As for Ridgerest, the matter didn't fully end for them at the board meeting. County review of the covenant breach and related conduct remained active. Developers like public silence. Public records make them uncomfortable. That uncomfortableness has a way of producing better behavior. Spring started showing itself around then. The drainage ditch worked exactly the way it was supposed to. Wheat greened up. The cattle moved easier as the cold eased. Toe marks in the field softened under weather and growth. Life on a farm has a way of refusing to stay centered on a dispute forever. That's one of its gifts. Still, there was one part of this whole ordeal I hadn't yet settled in my own mind. What to do with the part of the outcome that was bigger than reimbursement? Because once the dust clears and the lawyers go home, a man still has to decide whether a bad experience will simply be survived or turned into something useful. And that choice, more than the meeting or the settlement, is the part of this story I value most now. I could have treated the settlement as the end of the fight. Instead, I decided it needed to become the beginning of something that would outlast all of us. When the legal noise finally quieted down, people assumed the story was over. In the narrow sense, it was. The complaints had stopped. The petition was withdrawn. The HOA backed off. The developer had been forced onto the record. My legal costs were covered. The false online claims were retracted. From the outside, that looks like a clean ending. But I've never believed land fights are only about land. Most of the time, they're about continuity. Will the place still function 5 years from now? 10? Will the next generation see any reason to stay connected to it? Will a family operation remain viable, or will it get slowly pressed into becoming the next row of lots with decorative trees and restrictive covenants? That was the question underneath everything Beverly did, whether she admitted it or not. Not whether my silo looked nice from a walking trail. Not whether dust drifted on dry days. Not whether cattle, tractors, or harvest lights offended subdivision expectations. The real issue was whether a working farm had a right to keep being a working farm when development decided it preferred a different view. And once I understood that clearly, I knew I didn't want the outcome of this whole mess to be just a private payment and a stack of archived documents. I wanted something constructive, something that pointed forward. Prescott and I talked in April about what came next. There was a portion of the settlement, beyond direct reimbursement and immediate recovery, that could have simply disappeared into operating expenses or equipment needs. Lord knows any farm can absorb money fast enough. Tires, fencing, fuel, repairs, veterinary costs, seed, insurance. There is no shortage of places to put funds. But I had been sitting with an idea for months. During those winter evenings when the excavator sat cooling in the barn and the paperwork was spread out under shop lights, I kept thinking about what would matter more than winning. The answer was simple. Help the next people who might be willing to stay in agriculture. So we established the Warden Agricultural Scholarship through the local community foundation. 2 students from the county each year. Priority for children from farming families. Support directed toward agricultural sciences, farm management, agribusiness, and related study with a clear path back into the work that actually keeps counties like ours alive. That mattered to me because the pressure on farms isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it comes as lawsuits and petitions. More often it comes as economics, fatigue, and the constant message that the real future is somewhere else. In that environment, even a modest signal that somebody values the next generation can carry weight. The first recipients were announced in May. One came from a cattle family, smart, grounded, wanted formal livestock management training and planned to return home after school. The other came from an orchard operation and wanted to study agricultural business so the family enterprise could survive the numbers side as well as the field side. Both of them shook my hand. Both of them thanked me. I told them some version of what my grandfather would have said if he'd been standing there instead of me. The land doesn't promise you ease. You earn what it gives. You respect it, study it, work it honestly, and try to leave it better than you found it. Everything important follows from that. By then, the farm had resumed its normal rhythm. The winter wheat came in strong. The drainage line held and moved water the way it was supposed to. Cattle put on good condition in spring grass. Grit resumed his preferred evening position under my truck while I handled paperwork on the porch. Across the fence line, most of the folks from Sunrise Estates waved when they saw me on the road, which is exactly how neighbors ought to function when nobody is trying to run a land campaign. And that's maybe the strangest part of all this. The actual ending wasn't explosive. It was ordinary, in the best possible way. No more certified letters, no more bogus filings, no more made-up environmental alarms, no more unauthorized cones, fake reviews, or luxury vehicles trespassing in the field before dawn. Just work. That's all I ever wanted in the first place. The right to work my own land without being harassed by people who chose to move beside the reality of agriculture and then decided the reality offended them. Looking back, I'm proud of a few things. I'm proud I didn't lose my temper publicly. I'm proud I documented everything. I'm proud I listened to good legal advice instead of trying to win the argument emotionally. I'm proud I didn't destroy property or step outside the law, even when I had every reason to feel anger. And yes, I'll admit it, I'm also a little proud that the most memorable image in the entire dispute turned out to be a white Lexus sitting helplessly in the middle of a field because its owner mistook arrogance for authority. But more than any of that, I'm proud the farm is still here, still producing, still in the family line, still agricultural land, same as it has been since 1951. That matters in a way people outside rural life often miss. Farms are not just businesses. They are continuity. They carry memory, labor, weather, skill, failure, recovery, and the accumulated judgment of generations. Once they're gone, they don't come back easily. A subdivision can be built in months. A real farm is built over lifetimes. So if there's any lesson in this story, maybe it's this. Patience is not weakness. Paper trails beat outrage. Public records matter. And when somebody mistakes your quiet for surrender, let them. Sometimes the strongest position a person can take is to stay steady, keep notes, trust the process, and wait for the truth to become impossible to dodge. That's what I did. And in the end, the land stayed what it had always been, a farm. Not a view to be hidden, not a nuisance to be managed, not an obstacle to somebody else's expansion plan. A farm. And around here, that still means something.